So objective morality versus subjective morality is a pretty simple concept to explain. Morals are either subjective opinions or objective facts. Here's somebody expressing a subjectivist point of view.
Imagining, for example, some version of World War II where the fighting was based on some fundamental value conflict about what you're allowed to do to other human beings. Violent conflict. Is there a sense in which we can say that one side is correct there?
I feel like to say one side is correct, I feel like you would have to be able to ultimately resolve some moral statement down to some truth value. There would have to be some moral facts to speak of, and I don't really believe in stuff like that. So I wouldn't be able to say at the end of the day that like it's right to not want to enslave somebody or it's right to not want to murder somebody. I don't know if I believe that any of those moral statements ultimately reduce to some fact of the matter. So no, I don't know if I could ever say there's a right or wrong side in any given conflict like that.
Now, there are a lot of ways that people can express the moral objectivist point of view. Maybe morals extend from human nature. Maybe they exist as metaphysical abstractions in the way that numbers do. Or maybe morals are a conclusion that we can reach from logical syllogisms. The problem with all these theories is, well, how? What is it about human nature and looking at human nature that can tell us how human beings ought to behave, especially when you consider some of the more unsavory aspects of human nature? If morals exist as an abstract concept, like logic or numbers do, well, how exactly do we prove that? I think most people can understand the concept that if I have two things, and then I add two more things, I have four things, and it is objectively true, even if we remove the things themselves and just consider the numbers themselves, that in a metaphysical abstraction 2 + 2 = 4. But if you point at a human that is doing something I would consider to be wrong and you instead say what they're doing is perfectly moral, I don't think it's as easy for me to claim that you are as objectively wrong about that as you would be if you claimed that 2 + 2 = 5. All of this comes back to the basic issue with objective morality and the main argument for affirming ethical subjectivism. We cannot derive an ought from an is. We can describe in elaborate and exhaustive detail how the world is, that is the realm of objective facts, but there is nothing in what we can observe of how things are that can tell us how they ought to be instead. If you want to have opinions about how things ought to be, or what we should do if we want to be ethical, you have to decide that for yourself. You won't be able to conclude that based on a purely objective inquiry into the facts of the universe. The one argument for objective morality I haven't mentioned is divine command theory, which certainly to a lot of people is the most appealing. Essentially, the reasoning of divine command theory is that if the entire universe, including all of the objective facts of the universe, came from a conscious mind, and that mind has prescriptions about what is and isn't moral, it would follow that those moral claims now become facts of the universe. Basically, God is the final authority, and all moral debate is basically a discussion about what God thinks. A good way to conceive of objective morality is perhaps less to think about what it means to be correct about your morality, and more to consider the possibility of being wrong. I remember one time I was arguing with someone about abortion. This was a very long time ago, and I was espousing the pro-choice position while they were espousing the pro-life one. And the question, of course, there is whether it is morally wrong to end the life of a baby. And I said, in regard to that central question, that it is always better to err on the side of maximizing freedom than to err on the side of preserving human life. So you'd rather find out that abortion is morally wrong and be left saying, well, at least we didn't restrict people's freedom, than find out that abortion is actually perfectly okay and there is nothing morally wrong with it and be left saying, oh, okay, so I guess all of those women who we forced to bring to term babies that they didn't want, that was all for nothing. Now, that reasoning aside, the interesting thing about that statement I made there was the presumption that it is possible to be wrong about morality, and more significantly, it's possible to find out that you're wrong. I think we'd all agree this would be a strong indication of morality being objective. If you could find out that you are wrong about it, clearly there was a correct answer. And I think the closest most people could conceive of to a finding out you were wrong about morality moment would be if God is the final moral authority. PSA, by the way, for some atheists, this is the point that's being made when people talk about whether, without God, there is a standard for objective morality. A lot of people hear of a moral moral argument against atheism, and they assume that the argument being made is that atheists cannot be moral. For the record, the moral argument when made by Christians allows for the possibility that atheists might be just as moral as Christians, or just as many righteous, just as many wicked, and a equal proportion of people in between. It isn't about whether atheists are good people. They might even be better morally, but the question is about whether there exists an ultimate standard for goodness in the first place. A Christian could say that if an atheist takes care of the orphan, the widowed, the foreigner, then they are being moral. Indeed, they could say that they are being objectively moral. But the point would be that they are being objectively moral because the perfect holy word of God, which is the ultimate standard for morality, says that is the right thing to do. So I just wanted to clarify that point. If you're an atheist who's ever encountered a Christian who said, you have no objective standard for morality, they're not saying that you are immoral. Indeed, by their objective standard, you might be more moral than them and more moral than most Christians. Anyway, I say all of this not to defend divine command theory as accurate, but just to defend it from being misunderstood, because I think whatever your opinion on anything, you have to understand what arguments are actually being made. And there are issues with divine command theory, the most obvious one being the Euthyphro dilemma. Basically, the question there is simply, why is it that what God commands is perfectly moral? Is it because God is just always going to affirm that which is good? Well, the problem is there you seem to be invoking a pre-existent standard for goodness to which even God is beholden. Or else is it the case that there is no pre-existent standard and God brings morality into existence simply by commanding it? The problem there is that seems kind of arbitrary. Like God could have just taken what he commanded to be morally righteous in this reality and in another one have said that that is in fact morally evil, and then objective morality would completely flip on its head. You may be wondering whether I am a divine command theorist. I mean, so far I've kind of presented the case for it and I've kind of presented the case against it. Ultimately, the arguments I present shouldn't be taken as an indication of whether I agree with a position or not. I just understand the arguments pertaining to it. I mean, heck, a bigger question is, do I think morality is objective or subjective? I haven't actually given my position on that issue in this video yet. I've just presented the arguments around it. See, first of all, before I give my opinion, I want to look at somebody who I believe does a very bad job at defending objective morality. Sam Harris, specifically in his debate with Professor William Lane Craig on whether it is possible to affirm objective morality without believing in God. Now, for the record, Harris's performance in this debate is very bad, but it's kind of so bad that it doesn't actually suggest his position is wrong, because there are many people who have defended his position and done a much better job than he did. It's funny, the first time I watched this debate was back when I was still an atheist, and I remember distinctly thinking, oh, so it is possible for an atheist to get completely trounced in an intellectual debate with a Christian. Cool. Also, as I was listening back to it for this video, I remembered when I was first listening to this debate, it was when that game Temple Run on people's phones was really popular. And as I was listening, I just kept seeing in my mind's eye those coins that I had to collect and those gaps I had to jump over. Anyway, so Sam's basic contention is that morality is about well-being. And when we say that something is good or bad, we're identifying whether it increases or decreases human well-being. And he acknowledges that the challenge is to engage with people who might say of someone who disagrees with him,
what if he has an alternate conception of well-being that's just as legitimate? Or who's to say that we should care about the well-being of little girls?
That's the issue, right? I mean, in a TED Talk independent of this debate, Harris said this.
But values are a certain kind of fact. Okay, they are facts about the well-being of conscious creatures.
Now, that seems like an obviously stupid statement to me. Firstly, you only decide they're facts about the well-being of conscious creatures by having already decided that you care about the well-being of conscious creatures. But, well, that's about what you value, right? So how can you define what values are by starting with a presupposition that required you to have already placed value on something? What if someone doesn't share Harris's concern about the well-being of conscious creatures? What if someone thinks something else matters? What could Harris say to them to demonstrate that they are wrong? His only response is to take a really extreme example and say, well, clearly this is wrong.
What I'm saying is the minimum standard of moral goodness is to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. If we should do anything in this universe, if we ought to do anything, if we have a moral duty to do anything, it's to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone.
An analogy I make here is that we might say a minimum standard for what color a room should be painted is that it shouldn't be painted this kind of disgusting shade of browny grey that no person could possibly think would look nice in a room. And certainly the vast majority of people would agree, well, yeah, clearly that's not a very nice color. I would not like to see a room painted that color. So we could say, all right, that is the minimum standard. That's the extreme example of a really unpleasant color that everyone would agree is just terrible. But does that now mean that we can infer from this an objective standard by which we could determine the best color? I mean, what's your favorite color is surely one of the most subjective questions out there, and yet we can use Sam's very logic to supposedly demonstrate that this question has an objectively correct answer. I can't really evidence, by the way, that Sam lost the debate because the main issue is just that he doesn't respond to a whole load of William Lane Craig's objections. Like, I'd have to show you every single point that Craig makes and then show you everything that Harris says in order to demonstrate that he doesn't actually respond to any of it, and at that point, I would just have to show you the entire debate. You're welcome to watch the entire debate, by the way. It is quite interesting. But spoiler alert, he did lose the debate, emphatically. Craig brought up basically every single argument I've made so far, and many more, in order to show that Harris's position, well, it's barely even a position. And the key question hanging over all of this is that is-ought distinction. How can we say, based on the way the world is, that there is a certain way it ought to be, and that is a fact? When I say that something is morally right or morally wrong, I'm not just saying that's my opinion with which you may disagree. I'm saying that is an objective fact. And if you do disagree, you are factually wrong. Anyway, so clickbait watchdog, you may be wondering, what is the thing that everyone gets wrong? Well, I will now explain for you. See, Harris actually has a preoccupation in his obsession with metaethics, and it's got very little to do with philosophy and everything to do with politics. Harris has argued on multiple occasions that the US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan were justified. He's essentially a neoconservative. He has an infused fascination with what hypothetical scenarios would justify brutally torturing suspected terrorists. So it's not at all surprising where his focus lies when it comes to asserting that there is an objective standard for right and wrong.
Now, the Taliban are still my favorite example of a culture that is struggling mightily to build a society that's clearly less good than many other societies on offer.
Oh, are they still your favourite example, Sam? Well, colour me shocked. Just until the next time the US government wants to go into another country and overthrow their government, I'm sure, then there'll be a new favourite example. Sam's big concern is that ethical subjectivists are getting in the way of us making strongly worded moral critiques of other cultures.
Who are we to say that the proud denizens of an ancient culture are wrong to force their wives and daughters to live in cloth bags? Who are we to say even that they're wrong to beat them with lengths of steel cable or throw battery acid in their faces if they decline the privilege of being smothered in this way?
And considering the timing of when he started expressing these opinions, it seems pretty obvious that what he's saying is that if we can strongly condemn these cultures and stand in judgment over them, that would justify us using our military might to impose our values on them. He, for example, tells this story about a progressive coded academic who disagrees with his moral insights.
It is not unscientific to say that the Taliban are wrong about morality. That the moment we notice that we know anything at all about human well-being, we have to say this. And it turns out that to denigrate the Taliban at a scientific meeting is to court controversy. Mm-hmm. And after my remarks, I fell into debate with another invited speaker, and this is more or less exactly how our conversation went. She said, "How could you ever say that forcing women to wear burqas is wrong from the point of view of science?" I said, well, because I think it's pretty clear that right and wrong relate to human well-being, and it's just as clear that forcing half the population to live in cloth bags and beating them or killing them when they try to get out is not a way of maximizing human well-being. And she said, well, that's just your opinion.
Now, obviously, it's worth noting this woman did not express support for the Taliban. She simply suggested it's not a scientific fact that the Taliban is morally wrong. But he tells this story to make it sound like those who are not ready to declare that there are objective moral facts are primarily motivated by not wanting to stand in judgment over organizations like the Taliban. And he then goes on to say,
and she had just delivered a perfectly lucid lecture on the moral implications of neuroscience for the courts, and she was especially concerned that we could be subjecting captured terrorists to lie detection neuroimaging technology. And she viewed this as really an unconscionable violation of cognitive liberty. So on the one hand, her moral scruples were very finely calibrated to recoil from the slightest perceived misstep in ethical terms in our war on terror.
I mean, this isn't an incidental example. The motivations for telling us this story are pretty clear. This ethical subjectivist woman is all about morality being an opinion when it comes to defending her beloved Taliban. But as soon as our brave boys over at the CIA want to torture a terrorist, suddenly there's a big problem. For the record, I'm not saying that Sam Harris is wrong about philosophy because of his clear political priorities. I'm just saying that his political priorities are indeed clear. Side note about all this, there's something that I cut from that clip because it's not completely relevant to the point I was making, but it is very interesting.
And I said, okay, well, let's make it even easier. Let's say we found a culture that was literally removing the eyeballs of every third child, okay, at birth. Would you then agree that we had found a culture that was not perfectly maximizing human well-being? And she said it would depend on why they were doing it. So after my eyebrows returned from the back of my head.
So obviously Sam thinks this is a stupid response, but if we're talking about objective morality, it's an incredibly worthwhile thing to say. And the funny thing is that according to Sam's own reasoning, this is a worthwhile response. Because what did Sam say? Do you remember? Here it is again.
What I'm saying is the minimum standard of moral goodness is to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. If we should do anything in this universe, if we ought to do anything, if we have a moral duty to do anything, it's to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone.
So according to him, that's the minimum standard. That's the most important thing. So what if the reason they were doing it was to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone? I mean, it's an absurd hypothetical, but this is already a hypothetical in the first place, so let's hypothesize. According to Sam, if there was a race of aliens who said that we must remove the eyes from every third child, or else they would subject everyone to the worst possible misery, then not only would it be justified to comply with their demands and remove the eyes of every third child, but it would become a moral obligation. In fact, it would become the minimum standard for moral goodness. It would be the one thing we ought to do if we ought to do anything, because it's avoiding the worst possible misery for everyone.
If we ought to do anything, if we have a moral duty to do anything.
So that's a flaw in Sam's moral reasoning right there, I'd say. According to his logic, anything short of the worst possible misery for everyone could be justified as long as it helps us to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. Should we sacrifice babies by burning them alive? Well, if that somehow ends up avoiding the worst possible misery for everyone, that is the minimum standard for being a morally good person. The question, it would depend why they're doing it, becomes a supremely relevant question in Sam's moral philosophy, because if the answer is to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone, then that's the difference between an action being immoral, obviously immoral, and the minimum standard for being a good person. So I just think it's funny in this story where he's supposed to be making fun of a woman who disagrees with his interventionist politics, he accidentally includes an aside where he denigrates his own philosophical reasoning. It perhaps indicates that philosophical reasoning might not be his highest priority. Not that he tries to hide this. In his debate with William Lane Craig and also in his TED Talk, he stresses how important it is for society that we recognize objective morality exists.
The separation between science and human values is an illusion, and actually quite a dangerous one at this point in human history.
So that's the thing, right? This guy isn't motivated by philosophical reasoning. He thinks this distinction is dangerous and he's worried about the consequences of it being accepted.
The sense is that without the conviction that moral truths exist, that words like right and wrong and good and evil actually mean something, humanity will just lose its way. That's the fear, and I actually share that fear.
This is why we talk about appeal to consequence being a logical fallacy, because generally speaking, if you're preoccupied with the consequences of believing a truth claim, you're less likely to be concerned with whether that truth claim is actually true or not. He is scared of what could happen if people conclude that morality isn't objective. But here's the thing. Here's what everyone gets wrong about objective morality. None of this actually matters in terms of society and politics. Because here's the thing, meta-ethics has no bearing on your own sense of morality. The argument from Harris is quite clearly that if people are ethical subjectivists, that will affect their sense of morality and their willingness to go murder a bunch of Afghans into being free. More broadly speaking, there's this idea that if we are ethical subjectivists, we will become more liberal, more permissive, more pluralistic, and less likely to punish evil or intervene when we see it occur. Now, that concern is entirely and necessarily incoherent, because it's saying that what you believe to be true of ethics will determine what you judge to be ethical. But what did we say right at the start of this video? What's something very relevant to showing how this is all nonsense? Ethical subjectivism is grounded in the idea that you cannot infer an ought from an is. You can't look at the way something is, and from that, get any idea of how it ought to be. So saying that an ethical subjectivist would conclude that morality is subjective, and from that, they would get the conclusion that we ought not to intervene in other cultures is profoundly stupid. Because they would believe that the subjectivity of ethics is a fact, but as soon as they derive a moral value from that fact, they have now argued that we can derive values from facts and as such have abandoned the ethical subjectivist position. So despite the fact that this is a position a lot of people worry about, it is literally as far as it could be from being a position someone actually holds to, because it is completely self-contradictory. To illustrate this point further, consider the fact that any meta-ethical position can be paired with any person's individual ethics in a perfectly consistent way. And we'll stick with Harris's focus of whether someone could stand in moral judgment over the Taliban. And to make it more specifically about actions, we'll focus on the question of, should we intervene militarily in Afghanistan to depose the Taliban? Well, someone could say, I'm an ethical subjectivist, therefore I think morality is just about your feelings. We all subjectively judge what we personally consider to be right and wrong. And I personally judge that it would be perfectly moral to send troops into Afghanistan to depose the Taliban. There is no argument you could make against that person under ethical subjectivism because they're just saying that's their personal opinion. That would be like walking up to someone who says they like Mozart and saying, nope, wrong, incorrect. Now, obviously someone could also say, well, I'm an ethical subjectivist and I personally don't think we should intervene in other countries' affairs by invading them, and that is the position that terrifies Sam Harris. But again, there's no reason why one of those conclusions should more naturally follow from an ethical subjectivist position than the other. Indeed, as I've already said, it necessarily can't logically follow. Because if a moral value logically extends from a factual statement, that would make morality objective. What's an even more obvious point is that someone could believe in objective ethics and say, I believe that ethics are objective, and I believe that the objectively correct ethical position is pacifism. It is always, as a matter of fact, wrong to intervene militarily in another country's affairs, and if anyone disagrees with that, they are incorrect. Someone can believe that moral facts exist without thinking that one of those moral facts is that we need to go and depose the Taliban. Indeed, they could have objective morality that leads them to the exact opposite conclusion. This is the irony of people who talk about morality being objective. Almost always, they're talking about it under the assumption that their own morality that they already hold to will be the factually correct one, which in some sense makes it no different from subjective morality, just with an extra layer of arrogance.
So this, I think, is what the world needs now. It needs people like ourselves to admit that there are right and wrong answers to questions of human flourishing. And morality relates to that domain of facts.
Oh goodness me, that's what the world needs. It needs it. Hey guys, you need Sam Harris and people like him to admit that their morality is objectively the correct one. It's just so funny to say that morality is objective, but then qualify that by saying that it really matters who specifically is admitting this. Now, I'm not a grammar expert, but I'm pretty sure we have a word to describe the person who is doing something in a sentence. the subject. But yeah, the big point I don't want to understate here is the titular point of this video. For as much as people argue about whether ethics is objective or subjective, it has no implications whatsoever for society. People ask me whether I'm an ethical subjectivist or objectivist, and I pretty much always give the exact same response. Probably a subjectivist, but I don't really care, it doesn't really matter, and as such, I'm not particularly motivated to look into the issue in massive detail such that I can give a firm opinion one way or the other. Because ultimately, I feel like when I tell you that something is morally wrong, I'm giving you my opinion. I think it is morally wrong to put children on puberty blockers. I think it's morally wrong to not give to my Patreon. Sorry, I just realized I don't think I have a good opportunity to segue into a Patreon shout out in the middle of this video, and therefore I just thought I'd include it unnaturally here. Of course, a big thank you to those who contribute, and you actually are definitely objectively righteous people, and you're very much appreciated. But the point is, it really doesn't matter to me whether there is some axiom that is a foundation for my morals that I can argue is an objective fact of the universe. Because ultimately, it's not gonna make my argument more persuasive, me just insisting that I'm objectively right and the values that underpin everything I say are objective truths of the universe. And also, me considering my morality subjective isn't going to stop me from imposing my morality on other people, because why would it? Again, if I were to say that because my morality is subjective, I ought not to impose my morality on other people, that would be inferring an ought from an is, which would be a rejection of ethical subjectivity. I can say that murder is wrong, and if you murder someone, you should go to prison, and the state should ignore your personal opinion that murder is perfectly fine, and at no point in saying that have I argued or required that anything I'm saying is something other than my personal opinion. So that's the big thing that everyone gets wrong about objective morality, thinking that objective morality is somehow more legitimately enforced on other people than its subjective equivalent. Or, more generally, thinking that an ethical subjectivist position has to engender a more liberal, permissive, pluralistic society. I think while I'm here, I'll talk a little bit more about ethical philosophy in general, because for those of you who don't know much about this could be a useful primer, and if you're just interested in how I would talk about this, and maybe you're someone who knows better than me, well, you'll probably enjoy getting to make fun of me in the comments. I think one of the biggest things that anyone needs to understand about ethics is the three major ways that we can evaluate the ethics of an action. The first one that most people probably know is consequentialism. What it sounds like. You judge an action based on its consequences. An action is good or bad, depending on whether what it leads to is good or bad. This interestingly seems to be Harris's position, that morality is all about maximizing human flourishing. But there are some issues with this, especially the possibility that the ends might justify the means, which could be worrying if we're talking about some very unsavory means to achieve some apparently good consequences. And this is where the next type of ethics comes in, deontology, which also means what it sounds like if you know that ontology is basically the study of the fundamental nature of what things are, and of course the suffix de means to derive something from that. Basically, this is the type of ethics that says a certain type of action is bad, and if you do that action, you are bad, regardless of the consequences. These types of people are very into defining things as immoral. The most consistent example of this I encounter in political discourse is from right-wing libertarians who argue that taxation is theft. They start with the assumption that theft is bad, and they define theft as taking someone else's property via the threat of force or deception, and then they point out that taxation is when the state threatens force against you unless they give you money, therefore that is theft, and theft is bad, therefore taxation is immoral. While a consequentialist might focus on the potential benefits of an action, a deontologist would focus on the fact the action itself is bad, and therefore it can never be moral. It doesn't matter if you achieve some greater good through theft, theft is always an evil thing to do. These are the nerds who are forced to come up with incredibly convoluted answers to the simple question, would you lie to Germans in 1940 about the Jews you're hiding in your house? Because lying is immoral, and if you think that immoral actions are immoral by their very nature, you can't give the simple answer of, yes, I would lie in that situation because that's justified by the innocent lives I'd be protecting. And this leads us to the third understanding of ethics, virtue ethics. You could sort of define these three types of ethics by time. If consequentialism is about what happens after you perform a certain action, and deontology is about what's happening in the moment you're performing that action, then virtue ethics is about what happened before that action. Put another way, rather than being concerned with the nature or consequences of the action itself, virtue ethics is more concerned with the nature of the type of person who would do that action. Most people are virtue ethicists, seemingly, and there are some thought experiments that demonstrate this. You're probably familiar with the trolley problem. It's so overcomplicated now by memes that people forget what it was originally about. In its simplest, original form, it's mostly just intended as a proof to demonstrate the intuitiveness of virtue ethics. So obviously we all know the story. A train is heading down a track, it's going to hit 5 people, but you can just pull a lever, divert it, and it will only hit 1 person instead. Most people would say that they'd pull the lever in that situation, and that demonstrates that most people aren't deontologists, because a deontologist would say, well, you're performing an action there that leads to the death of someone. That's murder. That's always immoral. But clearly a lot of people think it's justified, I guess, because, well, the consequence of the action is that 1 person dies instead of 5. Which might suggest most people are consequentialists. The consequence of the action is that 4 fewer people die. That's a better outcome. Therefore, that's why it's the more moral decision. And this is why the traditional thought experiment only presents one other scenario. And I think this scenario is presented in all sorts of different ways, but here's the one I prefer. Imagine that there are 5 people in a room all about to die from organ failure. And in another room, there is 1 person who has entirely healthy organs. And if his organs were distributed amongst the 5 people who would otherwise die, they'll survive. Do you kill the 1 person to save the 5? The moral calculation is exactly the same here. Kill 1 person and 5 people will live. And yet most people would say no. Of course, they wouldn't murder someone and distribute their organs to save 5 people. That's sick. In fact, I imagine most people would find the idea that someone could say, yes, I would kill that person and harvest their organs, pretty horrifying. Anyway, so the point of the thought experiment is that there seems to be some difference between those 2 scenarios that has nothing to do with the consequences, nor even really to do with the basic nature of the action you're doing. Rather, it seems that for most people, it's the window dressing that makes the real moral difference here. In one situation, you're just pulling a lever, and that's fine. But killing someone and cutting them up, that is evil. And the insight of virtue ethics is that actually what we're thinking about of this scenario is the type of person who would do these actions and what this says about them. When we assess morality, we're looking for certain virtues in people, and the kind of person who would willfully murder someone and cut them up to harvest their organs is, to put it mildly, not someone we'd consider virtuous. Now, there are more complicated conceptions of all 3 of these ideas, a lot of which try to address many of the issues that, of course, philosophers have pointed out in discussing these topics for so long, but just to encourage some audience engagement, based on what you do know, which do you think is the best conception of morality? What I would point out, though, that's important for this video is that, again, none of these conceptions would require morality to be objective. When we talk about the consequences, we're talking about what consequences we personally value. When we argue that the intrinsic nature of an action is immoral, we're saying that's how we feel about it. And obviously, if we define morality by the virtues someone shows, we would need to have some values before then by which we determine someone to be virtuous in the first place. In a moment, I will return to objective morality and touch on how objective morality can intersect with your particular conception of ethics. But first of all, I do just want to talk about some moral considerations that aren't objective morality, but certainly can be conflated with it. Objective morality is not the same thing as absolute morality. Indeed, absolute morality, if it could be conflated with anything, it's basically deontology. It's a question of whether you think there can be certain scenarios that justify breaking the rules sometimes, or if you think the rules are the rules and you always need to stick to them no matter what. You can have an objective standard that is not absolute, though. You can believe that various objective values might introduce priorities that could contradict sometimes, and you might have to not do what is moral in some situations in order to achieve a greater morality down the line. line. And you can of course have subjective morality, where you personally refuse to accept any deviation from it whatsoever. An example of this is, for me, as someone who has said I probably lean ethical subjectivist, I am seriously morally opposed to torture. I suggested earlier I'm not particularly sympathetic to those who, due to their strong aversion to lying, would refuse to lie even to save a massive number of people's lives. But for me, torture is much worse than lying and actually does serve as a line that I think should never be crossed. As I said, Sam Harris is quite fond of coming up with ticking bomb scenarios that would justify torturing suspected terrorists. Like, what if someone hid a nuclear bomb in a city and the only way to find it before it detonated was to brutally torture them? Maybe a hot take from me, perhaps even a nuclear take, but in that scenario, the bomb's going off. I think that torture is always wrong and you should never do it in any circumstance. To intentionally maximize the amount of suffering and anguish that you're causing someone when they're completely at your mercy, that is a line that you never cross. Even if everyone in the world is going to die, you do not cross that line. So that is, for me, an absolute moral line that I would never cross. But again, I don't need to believe that is an objectively true moral belief to have in order to hold to that absolute position. There's also universality, which is again a totally separate issue from objectivity versus subjectivity. So an obvious example of this might be that we'd say you shouldn't judge slave traders from the past in really harsh moral terms, because at the time, basically everyone was practicing slavery, so that was the standard. You might be thinking, hold on a minute, how am I saying that's different from ethical subjectivism? Surely that's like the definition of ethical subjectivism, right? Well, no. I might say that someone from the distant past had good scientific knowledge for the time, or I might say that a 5-year-old is good at maths for their age. Does this mean that those things are now subjective? No, in fact, if anything, it implies they are objective, because I'm saying that their age or the time when they lived had with it certain expectations that can be judged relative to some other standard that we have now. In reality, though, this is neither about subjectivity nor objectivity. It's just a pretty obvious point, right? Like, of course, there's a difference between me capturing a bunch of people and forcing them to work on my garden as slave labor and a southern plantation owner doing that similar thing in the antebellum United States. It doesn't mean that the action itself is any more or less moral. It just means that it's pretty stupid to look at someone and say, well, that person is totally evil, when they were, to be fair, just doing what was totally expected of even a good person back in the time when they were alive. I mean, I'm not saying that there's no room for debate here. Maybe you could argue that every single person should be judged by the exact same standard, regardless of just how corrupt and morally evil the society they grew up in was. But either way, the point is, I want to stress this isn't about objective or subjective morality. I could say, I subjectively think this thing is immoral, but I'm willing to be lenient to people who grew up in a context where they wouldn't have any reason at all to think that thing is immoral. And likewise, I could say that I think that it is an objective fact that this thing is immoral, but I'm willing to be lenient to someone who wouldn't have known about these objective facts, just as I could be lenient to someone about their scientific knowledge if they grew up in an illiterate third world country. And now we move on to the big one, possibly another strong contender for what everyone gets wrong about objective morality, and that is the belief that the number of people who agree on morality correlates to it being objective. The real insanity of this is that in some sense, the definition of objective is literally the exact opposite. If nobody believed this thing, it would still be true. Like maths is objective because even if everyone thought that 2 + 2 = 5, the answer would still be 4. In the same sense, if morality is objective, that would mean that even if everyone thought that abortion, for example, was moral, it could still be true that objectively it is a fact that it is immoral. So if you've ever said, well, clearly morality isn't objective because nobody can agree on it, stop that. That's not how this works. What's funny is that, to return back to this being sort of a response to Sam Harris, he appears to make this exact same mistake.
Okay, and there is no notion, no version of human morality and human values that I've ever come across that is not at some point reducible to a concern about conscious experience.
Even if there was no version of morality that wasn't in some sense concerned with conscious human experience, that wouldn't make it objective, Sam. Because the definition of objective entails that it's possible for literally everyone to be wrong about something, right? I don't know if it's actually true that everyone once thought the Earth was flat, but what we do know for certain is that even if everyone did think that, that wouldn't make it flat. And nobody would be justified in saying, there is no conception of the Earth that doesn't understand it as flat, therefore it is objectively true that the Earth is flat. But I tell you what's funny, in this very talk, Sam massively contradicts himself on this point.
The irony, from my perspective, is that the only people who seem to generally agree with me and who think that there are right and wrong answers to moral questions are religious demagogues of one form or another. And of course, they think they have right answers to moral questions because they got these answers from a voice in a whirlwind. Okay, not because they made an intelligent analysis of the causes and condition of human and animal well-being. And in fact, the endurance of religion as a lens through which most people view moral questions has separated most moral talk from real questions of human and animal suffering. Separated most moral talk from real questions of human and animal suffering.
So not only is it not true that there is no moral system that isn't concerned with human and animal suffering, but apparently most moral talk has now been separated from that concern. According to him, most people don't base their morality on minimizing or maximizing human suffering, but instead on divine command theory. So that seems like a pretty obvious self-contradiction, but Harris has actually managed to equivocate on this point. See, what he advocates for is a robust scientific focus on maximizing human flourishing, which he believes is an objective standard. But then what he says is that this is objective because there is no system of morality that isn't at some point concerned with suffering. And he even goes on to say this.
Even if you think that good and evil ultimately relate to conditions after death, either to an eternity of happiness with God or an eternity of suffering in hell, you are still concerned about consciousness and its changes.
But obviously this is stupid, right? He's conflating the consequences of immoral behavior with morality itself. Like, if I tell my kids that they can have some ice cream if they behave, that doesn't mean that morality is now reducible down to the acquisition of ice cream. It doesn't mean that morality is now ultimately concerned with ice cream. No, morality would be based on things like table manners and not having a screaming fit and doing your chores. So you can see how Harris's position breaks down to most people are at some point concerned with conscious experience and how that can involve suffering. Therefore, basically everyone agrees with my position that we should be focusing on maximizing human flourishing and avoiding the worst possible misery for everyone. And because basically everyone agrees with this and there's no conception of morality that really goes against it, therefore it's objective. And this is obviously spurious and dishonest reasoning. First of all, you have the tenuous connection between people being at some point concerned with suffering and this translating to people, I guess, agreeing with Harris's position, which is much more focused on a specific method of maximizing human flourishing and minimizing suffering. And then you have the fact that even if this tenuous connection was valid, and it was true basically everyone agreed with him, even still, that wouldn't make his position objectively correct. It's like me saying that everyone is at some point concerned with whether or not a movie makes them laugh, therefore everyone agrees with me that the best possible movie, objectively speaking, would be a movie that maximizes the opportunity for hilarity and having fantastic jokes that are all just 10 out of 10, and therefore, since the movie that does that is Daddy's Home 2, it must be the objectively best movie of all time. You know, it's like someone presenting that reasoning except for something that's not correct. Obviously, we know that Daddy's Home 2 is objectively the best movie of all time. I guess all of this sort of compounds the point I made already, that ultimately, objective morality doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter in terms of politics or how we organize society, because someone can hold to any ethical position regardless of their meta-ethics, and it doesn't matter for any of the complexities of how we understand morality. You can be a deontologist with a strong belief in moral absolutes, but a willingness to appraise an individual's morality according to the context in which they grew up, while at the same time finding a large number of people who agree with you on this. And the question of whether you believe morality is objective or subjective remains entirely unimplicated in all of that. But with that said, I do just want to address some reasonably compelling conceptions of morality as objective for your consideration. I think probably the most interesting one is touched on by Harris here.
There are many ways for my values to be objectively wrong. They can be wrong with respect to deeper values that I hold. They can be wrong with respect to deeper values that I would hold if I were only a deeper person.
So obviously this does get at the point that morality can be objectively wrong with reference to other values. Nobody's denying that. So if one of my values is that I think human life is incredibly precious, but then I have another value that leads me to needlessly take huge amounts of human life, clearly there is an objective contradiction in my values there. But that doesn't prove values overall are objective, because obviously you have to have the initial values in place already in order for something to objectively contradict them. What's interesting though is that almost parenthetical comment, they could be wrong with respect to the values I would have if I were a deeper person. There is an argument to be made that virtue ethics is a good foundation for objective morality. The argument would be that there is a type of person who is objectively knowledgeable and wise and logical. These are the kinds of things we can test objectively. How many languages does someone speak? How many classics of literature have they read? How do they do in a maths test? IQ tests purport to be an overall assessment of somebody's intelligence. There is an argument that could be made that this is the way a human should be, and as such, we can imagine a supremely virtuous person without having to appeal to subjective moralistic values. Rather, from the objective reality of knowledge and human nature itself, we can envision the type of person who is just humaning the best. These are the types of people Plato imagined as philosopher kings, the technocrats who by objective standards can prove their surpassing quality as human beings. And the contention is that such a person would have a particular set of values, and those are the values to which we should aspire. And you can see Harris advance on this point a bit later.
When talking about morality, we value differences of opinion in a way that we don't in any other area of our lives. So for instance, the Dalai Lama gets up every morning meditating on compassion, and he thinks that helping other human beings is an integral component of human happiness. Okay. On the other hand, we have someone like Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was very fond of abducting and raping and torturing and killing young women.
And he then goes on to argue that rather than valuing differences of opinion as equally valid, we should instead regard certain individuals as moral experts.
What would happen if I showed up at a physics conference and said string theory is bogus? You know, it doesn't resonate with me. It's not how I choose to view the universe at the smallest scale. I'm not a fan. Okay? Well, nothing would happen because I'm not a physicist. I don't understand string theory. I'm the Ted Bundy of string theory.
So somebody who eats right, meditates, exercises, practices self-discipline, seeks to expand their knowledge and is committed to being an empiricist, this speaks to their quality as an authority, but it also perhaps speaks to them being a role model. And the argument would be, well, such a person is clearly someone we should listen to on issues of morality. I think one of the appealing aspects of virtue ethics is that it has very attractive implications for how we should organize society. In consequentialism and deontology, they're much more concerned with prohibiting actions. Don't do this. Whereas virtue ethics is ultimately about endorsing a state of being. Be the kind of person who is virtuous, and ethical behavior will extend from that. Is it right or wrong to eat meat? That's the wrong question. Are you someone who appreciates the beauty of nature and is in tune with the balance of the natural world? If so, then your relationship to eating meat as someone who has those virtues is what's going to determine the morality of it. By contrast, if you're someone who is ignorant to the world and issues of sustainability and the suffering of animals in modern factory farming, if your only priority is consuming meat calories as cheaply and conveniently as possible, well then for you, eating meat could never possibly be moral because of the attitude with which you're approaching it. And the appeal here is that therefore what we should want to do to maximize morality is to maximize knowledge and wisdom. So that's the appeal of virtue ethics. In case you can't tell, by the way, I am a virtue ethicist. I do believe that morality starts with me trying to be a virtuous person in myself. The appeal of virtue ethics for a moral objectivist is that it can relate to more philosophically grounded ideas of truth, especially as it relates to purpose. A really common argument for objective morality is that just as a container with a crack at the bottom is broken, just as a TV that only displays static and no pictures or sounds isn't fit for purpose, likewise a person who refuses to use their intelligence and wisdom that extends fundamentally from what they are is not doing their purpose, and therefore we can say that a morality that extends from ignorance is objectively a failed one. Because, it's a fact that we as human beings have evolved to be more intelligent. That is part of our purpose. We didn't evolve these brains for no reason. So that would be the argument, that we can derive this idea of human beings having a purpose by looking at the objective reality of our evolution and how we came to get here, and from this, we can infer a morality that is grounded in objective fact. The problem here is that there is actually a massive difference between identifying a purpose in a biological sense and identifying a purpose in a normative, moralistic sense. As you'll know if you have any interest in defending the sex binary, human beings are organized around facilitating the function of the small or large gamete in sexual reproduction. So we could say quite as clear as day that that is one of our purposes, that we evolved to continue the species through reproduction. But to say from this that someone has a moral obligation to perform this role would be contended, to say the least. Honestly, I think that virtue ethics is fantastic if you're willing to accept some subjective axioms, but I don't think it quite does the job of removing the need for those axioms and just showing that objectively this morality extends from reality itself. I will, however, share with you one argument for objective morality that I heard many years ago and still sticks with me. It's called the broccoli thought experiment, and it actually takes the form of a joke. A child says, "I'm glad I don't like broccoli, because if I did like broccoli, I would eat a lot of it, and broccoli's gross." Now, the silly thing about this statement is that broccoli being gross is an evaluative judgment contingent on the child not liking broccoli. So if they did like broccoli, it wouldn't be gross to them anymore. So actually, if the child did like broccoli, it wouldn't matter if they ate loads of it, because broccoli isn't actually gross. That was just the child's opinion of it, that it was gross, because they didn't like it. Yes, it's a very good joke indeed, always gets a laugh from philosophers. Now, another scenario worth considering is a biologist who might say, I'm glad I wasn't indoctrinated into young Earth creationism, because then I would believe a falsehood. Now, this is different. It's quite a reasonable thing for a biologist to say, especially if they derive enjoyment from their knowledge of natural history. But the main reason it's different here is that biology is objective. Them not believing in evolution wouldn't change the most important thing about it. It's still true. And the final example here would be someone who says, I'm glad that I didn't grow up during a time when the slave trade was rampant, because then I would have grown up believing that thing was okay and possibly even participating in that evil, wicked behavior. Hopefully you can already see where this argument is going. The point is that the statement about morality actually seems much more similar to the statement about scientific fact than it does to the statement about just personal taste. Unfortunately, as convoluted and perhaps seemingly impressive as this analogy is, it flops hard based on one simple issue. It fails to consider the fact that people might care about their subjective opinions to varying extents, to the point that they might care about their subjective opinions more than they care about objective facts, but that doesn't prove that they are objective facts. A grunge fan might care more about Nirvana being the greatest band of all time than they do about the Earth being a globe. But that doesn't make the former an objective fact in the same way the latter is. A film connoisseur might care more about Daddy's Home 2 being the greatest film of all time than they care about any fact or anything else in the universe. But again, that doesn't make it objectively true, even though it actually is in that case. All this thought experiment shows is that people care very strongly about morality, and actually I imagine it doesn't surprise you at all. Harris also tries to relate science to morality by conflating the values that underpin the two things.
Okay, all we can do is appeal to scientific values, the value of understanding the world, the value of evidence, the value of logical consistency.
His basic argument here is that, sure, someone might reject moral values, but someone might also reject scientific values. If somebody rejects the value of evidence and truth, then there's no value we could then point to get them to change their mind. There's no reasoning we could offer to them if they reject the axiomatic values that underpin reason itself. But the issue here is that even if nobody valued logic, what is logical would still be true. If nobody cared about mathematics, mathematical truth would still be correct. Harris would have to show that moral values continue to be true even if nobody accepted these values, and he certainly failed to do that. Indeed, as as we've shown, he's sort of gone in the exact opposite direction, trying to argue that his morality is objective because most people agree with it. Although on that note, Harris has asked a very interesting and probing question. What would he do if his method for assessing morality showed the things that he values to actually be objectively wrong?
Everything is not going to be up for grabs. It's not going to be like, veiling my daughter from birth is just as good as teaching her to be confident and well-educated in the context of men who do desire women. So I don't think we need an NSF grant to know that compulsory veiling is a bad idea. But at a certain point, we're going to be able to scan the brains of everyone involved and actually interrogate them. Do people love their daughters just as much in these systems? And I think they're clearly right answers to that.
And if the results come out that actually they do, are you prepared to shift your instinctive current judgment on some of these issues?
Well, yeah, modulo one obvious fact that you can love someone in the context of a truly delusional belief system.
Now, to me, it seems obvious that Harris is just going to keep shifting the goalposts to avoid accepting any conclusion that would go against his own personal values. Which sort of defeats the point, right? And it was when watching this clip that I stumbled upon what I would humbly call a quite important insight about why it isn't really good to understand morality as objective, certainly not in the same way we understand science as objective. In science, people enter into scientific discovery and assess their beliefs with the expectation that their beliefs could be wrong, and this is actually celebrated as a good thing about science. The idealized notion of a scientist is someone who says, I think this thing might be true, but it could be wrong, and then they go out trying to prove that what they believe is wrong. And most people would say, wow, well done, way to be a fantastic scientist. This is not, nor will it ever be, how morality works. Imagine if I said, I think that paedophilia is wrong. I really truly believe that it is wrong. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe paedophilia is fantastic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to engage in an honest moral inquiry into whether paedophilia is actually totally okay, and I'm going to go into it fully expecting and anticipating that I could discover it's totally fine, and that is an aspect of this moral discovery that I fully embrace. Would that sentiment be well regarded? Would people think that is an attitude I should have? If something is objective, that means you could be wrong about it. I don't know about you, but I don't really want my opinion on paedophilia to be part of the realm of objective reality, because then that opens the possibility that objective morality might contradict my beliefs. The point of this video was for me to debunk Sam Harris and many other people who seem to think that the problem with ethical subjectivism is that it undermines a foundation for making strong moral claims. But in actual fact, it's literally the exact opposite, because objectivity is a much more shaky grounds for claims, because when things are objective, when there is an objective reality out there that you are either right or wrong about, that means you could be wrong about it. By contrast, when you understand ethics as subjective, there is no way you could be wrong about it, because there is no right or wrong. It's just your opinion. It's your responsibility, and whatever position you hold to, that's on you. So I would personally much rather say that I think subjectively, according to my values, which I am very proud of, I think that paedophilia is wrong. That is my position. It's a position I'm absolutely going to stand by, and I'm not going to entertain the idea that there is some objective reality that my opinion will be judged by. If I think that there is an objective standard, then I can sort of at best say, well, I think that it's wrong, but maybe it isn't. I mean, for all objective matters apart from basically the truth of my own existence, I can't be 100% certain about it, right? I think that the Earth is a globe, but I'm not 100% certain. I mean, maybe there is this big crazy conspiracy because people don't want us to think about what's beyond the Antarctic ice wall. It's a possibility. It's a very, very low possibility, but I can't say with 100% certainty that's not the case. I mean, I can't even say with 100% certainty what I had for breakfast this morning. My senses are not perfect. My memory is not perfect. The nature of objective reality is that you could be wrong about it. And you know what? I'm okay with being wrong about most things. If I am actually wrong about the shape of the Earth, or I've misremembered what I've had for breakfast, then okay, fine, whatever. I'm not happy for that to be the case with objective morality. If I say something is wrong, like evil, morally, then I don't want to believe that there is some objective standard out there, which means I could be totally off base about that. The reason I don't like divine command theory is because, well, what if there is a God out there and their morality is just totally contrary to everything that I value, and they think that things that I think are absolutely wicked are in fact perfectly fine? Am I suddenly going to actually believe that what I thought was evil and wicked 5 seconds ago is now perfectly moral and righteous? No, of course not. Sam Harris makes this bold statement that underpins the whole position that this video has been arguing against.
Just admitting that there are right and wrong answers to the question of how humans flourish will change the way we talk about morality, and will change our expectations of human cooperation in the future.
Most of this video has been me utterly opposing that and making it clear that regardless of your meta-ethics, you can still pretty much talk about morality in the same way. Except for just in those last few minutes where I was arguing that actually objective morality might change the way that we talk about morality, but for the worse. But I will say one more thing on this subject of how we talk about morality. I think that it makes sense and it's perfectly fine for people to talk about morality as if it is objective. When I point out that something is immoral, I say, hey, that's wrong, you're a bad person, and I very rarely take the time to clarify in my own personal subjective opinion. I don't think this is a big deal. I don't think we need to agonize about the fact the way we talk about morality isn't entirely based on a robust philosophical justification for talking about morality in that way. A lot of the arguments for objective morality that you'll see can basically be boiled down to people act as if morality is objective, therefore it is. And I don't find that particularly convincing. And that's for the simple reason that we use language colloquially. The way we talk about things isn't always going to line up with an overly intellectual, academic, philosophical way of talking about the world, and it doesn't need to. That would be totally unnecessary. And it's just one final cherry on this cherry bakewell of a video asserting this basic point. Whether we conceive of morality as objective or subjective just doesn't really matter. And that's what everyone gets wrong. Anyway, everyone, I've recorded this video across 3 recording sessions. I recorded it last night, and I recorded a bit, then this morning, then I had to go to church, and now I'm back, but it is my grandma's birthday, and I have been upstairs, and I should come downstairs to see her. I was planning on uploading this on Sunday at the usual time, which would be 5:30. It is now 5:15. You are probably not even going to see this on Sunday. This will probably go up on Monday. Thing is, I am committed to doing 1 video per week, so even though last week there was no video at all, what I'll probably do is this video is up on Monday, the next video will be up on Friday, and then I will be back on top of things. If you don't know what's happening, I'll explain it very simply. And by the way, it's kind of annoying me that it's like blurry, whatever. My wife and I are moving house. There is a lot of stuff changing in our lives, and basically that brings with it distractions and makes it difficult to keep up with this channel. Now, here's the thing. I anticipated this, so I made a 2-part video already that I have in basically lined up. And you might say, well, why didn't you post that? And the reason why is because I don't think that video will do fantastically well. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, whatever, it is what it is. I again wasn't expecting that previous videos to do very well, but basically my last few videos haven't done that well. I have some other videos lined up, but I don't think those videos will do very well. So this video might do well. I kind of feel like the title could bring people in. I wouldn't be shocked if it doesn't do that well, but next video I'm hoping will do well. We'll see. Anyway, the point is I don't like to upload too many videos that don't do as well in a row, because obviously that's not as good for the algorithm. What I want to do is like a good video, then maybe a video that is like just to kind of keep things ticking along, but because, you know, they can't all be hits, right? And I accept that. But I do want to make sure that I don't cluster all of the duds together. It's kind of blurry and that's annoying me. Have I already said that? I don't know. Anyway, so like that's the thing. Basically, I've been trying to get this video done, but essentially once I've done the next 2 videos, well, this video and then the one after that, then I will be officially ahead of schedule because, like I say, I have 2 videos in the tank ready to go, but I'm just expecting that these 2 videos will be better than those, so whatever, that's the situation. The other thing is, and you know, I'm just going to mention this very quickly because it's really interesting. Essentially, a while ago I mentioned that I was working on a video, and then my productivity and my motivation to be productive was totally destroyed because randomly, and again, I could elaborate on this in detail, I will at some point, the video just, like the entire script just was randomly deleted. And obviously I had written the entire script, so I was incredibly frustrated about that. And this was like 2 months ago. And then I was like, you know what, fine, I'm going to work on this, you know, like I'm going to get it done, but I'm going to get it done once the pain of having had the video deleted is gone away, because otherwise I'm just going to be annoyed about having to write the video. Well, or write the script. Well, yeah, this is that video. And I can tell you that it was still incredibly annoying to write this script knowing that I had written it before. And for all I know, maybe the original script I wrote was way better, way more concise, or way more informative, or way better structured, because I kind of had to put things together, yeah, like after the fact. So I will go now, and yeah, you will get more updates from me. I don't really need to elaborate too much because, yeah, updates will be forthcoming in a designated video. And I will just say thank you everyone for watching. If you donate on Patreon, first of all, it's very appreciated. Of course, I'm sure you didn't need me to tell you that. This is probably going to be a long video, and you also get to watch a bonus video on Patreon. So this is a clip from that.
Also, this is a kind of a inversion of what they call the one joke or whatever, you know, about identity. If you can identify as a different gender than the one you were assigned with at birth, you can identify.
Yeah, I pointed out before, the thing about like the one joke is the reason why it's the thing. I mean, first of all, it's not the only like criticism. It's not the only comedic criticism people make. But the reason why people keep saying, well, if you're going to identify as, if a biological man is going to identify as a woman, why can't anyone identify as anything? The reason that's something people say is not because they're like really proud of this one joke they came up with. It's because we genuinely want an answer and you guys aren't able to give us one. Like, and yeah, maybe on like individual cases, you can say, oh, this specific like analogy doesn't work, but I've not heard any concrete explanation for why, in broad terms, trans identity is different from other forms of identity that would contradict apparent material reality. I hope you enjoyed that. And yeah, of course, if you really enjoyed it, then you can give and get access to all the previous videos. The other thing you can do, of course, is all the algorithm stuff that's got nothing to do with Patreon, liking, sharing, commenting, subscribing. That's all very appreciated. Yeah, I'm going to go hang out with my family again. Yeah, I think I mentioned it's my grandma's birthday. So wish her a happy birthday, and I will see you all, well, I was going to say next week. I won't see you all next week. I will see you all this week. But if I said that I'll see you all next week in my previous video, I lied, because I thought I would get this video out last week and I didn't. All right, bye.